back in the studio, and I'm here with Jane Curtis, who is our history guru. She's done some research for us on the end of World War I. So we're going to find out what little tidbits she's come up with that are interesting facts from that era. So Jane, enlighten us.
Good morning. Well, talking about the end of World War I, you notice I don't say the armistice or whatever.
Right.
I'm speaking of the end of hostilities and whether the war ended then, whether it did not really end then, and going.
I've heard there was some controversy
going on
over
from
that.
these things. So it's a matter not just of a nice targeted, focused, looking up, researching. The combination of all kinds of things from the past history of the era, and that came after. Now, if we think of the situation of the world, and particularly of the Western world, Western Europe, United States, British colonies, at the beginning of that war, on June the 28th, June the 28th, yeah, that's right, of 1914, when the young hothead, the Serbian guerrilla, Princip was his name, when he shot the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, this wasn't just an ordinary thing that passed in the night, like some of the assassinations of our presidents, for instance, McKinley. The world didn't jiggle on its axis when that happened. But when this one happened, it fed right into a series of interlocking alliances over Europe. You had, well, let's go into a little bit of a point by point here, and we can see it better. When he shot, as a Serbian, now he was a Serbian nationalist. Serbia was a kind of a state within the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Okay.
Russia, meanwhile, over there in the east, was this kind of patron of anything Slavic anywhere, so they were solidly behind Serbia. Mm-hmm. And when they threatened Serbia, when Austro-Hungary threatened it, what Russia did was mobilize their troops. Now, this wasn't declaring war, but then this took a while, that big country and poor transport and so on. But when Russia mobilizes troops, Russia had an alliance with France, but an attack on one was an attack on the other. Mm-hmm. So France mobilized its troops.
Okay.
Meanwhile, Germany had a plan, the German chancellor, and his plan was that they would take over in Western Europe, more or less. They would knock Russia out first. Russia was very weak after the Russo-Japanese War, 10 years before that, big giant. He would knock them out in a hurry and then go into France, and they would go through Belgium to get to France.
Okay.
And they were going to say to the Belgians, do you mind if we borrow some of your territory for a while, because we want to go down here and attack France from the north? And the Belgians said no. The Belgians were allied with England, and of course France and England were allied. So here you had this cobweb of, if it happens to one, the others will jump into the fray. So this was a situation when this happened. And the only one who really wanted war, I think, was the German chancellor.
Right.
I think they pretty well really do get the blame for that war. But it was a tinder keg before that. Meanwhile, the civilian population in the world, compared to today, where there are possible threats of nuclear war, saber rattling and so on, well, I think a little of that went on. An arms race went on at the time then. But nobody was seriously worried about it. Life went on. The aristocracy continued, and each country continued to do its thing. They were wealthy. They were center of many things. And then came this problem, and all of a sudden it was war. The English were pretty well prepared for it, because they'd been in on the arms race. The French maybe a little less so, and the Russians, of course, not at all. Mm-hmm. And the rest of Western Europe, Turkey had been hanging on to the Balkans very, very recently. Serbia had gotten off out from under Turkey in, I think it was 1908, but early, a little bit before World War I. That had really no excitement came from that particularly. The Turkish and the Ottoman Empire was weak, falling apart. So the world was pretty much minding its own business when that happened. People were having their afternoon coffee at cafes, you know, a nice June day. And when this happened, just overnight, you had the world at war and thinking, oh, it'll be over by Christmas, we'll teach them a lesson, that kind of thing. And it dragged on and on into a really beastly trench warfare. Now we compare that with what the situation was like at the end of that war. 4 years later, almost 4 years exactly, the Treaty of Versailles was not till, well, it was actually in 28th of June. It was the same as that thing that sparked the fire for World War I. But at the end of the war, what had happened? Well, England and Germany and France too were bled pretty white because you lost, killed over 7 million people. And civilians, a lot of civilians went too. Now, I checked the figures on that, whether 7 million includes civilian casualties. Most figures say they do not, that there's an additional 4 or 5 casualties. They were casualties, they were not all death. But here were these countries missing a whole generation of workers and of people who ran the local life. Imagine if all of our mayors.
Yeah, the leaders in each country.
Millions of our mayors were wiped out at once, pretty well at once. So at the end of the war, the situation was kind of sad. These alliances had fallen apart. I guess you'd say they'd fallen apart because they didn't make sense anymore.
Right.
Everybody was in a bad way. The war ended with the actual fighting ended with that treaty, the 11th November at 11 a.m. But much went on because, of course, the effects of it lasted on and on. Some people, some scholars in the field, historians, have maintained that the end of World War I equals the end of World War II. And I don't think you need to go that far because World War I was a watershed. Because on one side of it, society, the way society was set up, all of that, the modes of transportation, anything that made your daily life, was changed afterward. Because a stupendous development in transportation, in aviation. And many people went right from the war. Of course, aviation, the development was forced by the war, as it were, and to some extent automotive. Somebody like Eddie Rickenbacker, who was turned to be an automotive genius almost, as a very young person, self-taught. He went into the war late. He was in his 20s. But he, as an expert and racer, car racing, auto racing was already a big thing. He went into that. And then after the war, he went right on he stayed in aviation and other things. In fact, he used to run Eastern Airlines. He owned and ran Eastern Airlines. But others did the same thing. The Red Baron's brother, Lothar, was also a flyer. And he was actually killed in the mid-1920s in a plane crash. But how you made your living changed drastically. Look at motor transport from the very earliest sort of comical cars developed into, look at those trucks you see in all the pictures of World War I. And of course, military weapons, tanks developed in that war. The British were the leaders in that, I believe. Not only the tanks and the air, but the medical picture changed. This was one of the good things in a way. We had a show a while back on blood transfusing, the history of blood transfusing. And as that war began, there wasn't a very efficient way. And of course, bleeding to death was one of the important causes.
One of the big things,
But as a result of that war, plasma was developed, a means of caring for that sort of thing. At the frontline, first aid stations, they would have equipment for that in many cases. So basic things had changed in that war. Communications, look at the difference there. There were telephones, but there were, and very, very primitive movies, but they had nothing to do really with the way you instantly communicate now, transfer pictures and all of completely different on either side, because the 20s showed a lot of development there. The treaty that was made didn't take too much into account that it was going to take all these millions of people who had died to bring changes about, to rebuild everything, picture it. And of course Germany got hit the hardest, and Germany was the guiltiest. The leaders of Germany were the guiltiest. But when you compare it to World War II, when the Marshall Plan came up, it didn't say, okay, Germans, go over to that hole, we're going to pound you in. No, they said, we're going to build you up, put you back on your feet, and it certainly bore fruit. The Germans became the most pacifist nation for quite a while there. Didn't even have an army. But your developments during the war then caused advances in a way that, I say advances, even the bad ones that were bad, but they were progressions in technology and government. Now, democracy was introduced and pushed by Woodrow Wilson, by our own president. And we didn't get into the war until 1917 in the spring there, so we only had a year and a half of it that we were active participants. But he pushed very strongly. The Balkans were just kind of a boiling stew. Now, Romania fairly early became a kingdom. These things had been kingdoms, most of them. And of course the royalty remained in England. It was out in Germany. Austria, gone. So what did they have left? Well, all this nationalism came to the fore, and you had problems there, especially the Balkans. But they fell into a pattern of having many small units there, and the Turks out. That remains of the Turkish Empire were in very sad condition, but it too turned into a more modern state. But the Balkans had many little states, most of them not economically viable on their own. Whereas what they were replacing was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which certainly had its faults. But as an economic unit, it was a lot better. And with no transition, there were problems. It was not surprising. They put three of them together into Yugoslavia, which took a while to fall apart. But it's the League of Nations, when Wilson pushed it through to get the League of Nations approved, I don't think had an awful lot of effect. My oldest brother was in college in the 1930s, and he had a summer over there. It was some sort of a thing you could apply for that as a college. I think he was just out of college. But what he said that they, of course, he wouldn't have been in a position to know any secret, deep things about it. But he said it was kind of a get-together, and they discussed things, and although you might discuss now, but with no real meat underneath it. And then when Germany began to go against what it was supposed to do in the war, it reoccupied the Rhineland and got aviation going again under the guise of teenagers' clubs, flyers clubs. So the immediate result was that the war, that all of the antagonism was not wiped out. These little Balkan states all felt that they had they should have their say. They were important. Trade deals were more difficult than they had been, and the result was that the situation did continue, even though the war itself was gone. But why I say it was like a watershed was that the world was so different afterward, even culturally and socially. Most prominent thing socially was, of course, the rise of women's rights, of women as equal human beings. And as of just before the war, you had had a lot of agitation, particularly in England. Mrs. Pankhurst, Emmeline Pankhurst, they were demonstrating and doing various things. Lady Astor, American-born Lady Astor, was got herself elected to Parliament, and this women began getting more rights and having a little more influence. And of course, in 1920, finally, we did too. But you had too few men around to be doing the heavy lifting, so to speak, in the economies. This is faintly reminiscent of as far back as Viking times, if not farther, where the Vikings, the men would be off doing their thing, which was fighting and sailing, and doing things like that, while the women stayed home and ran the country.
Right.
So more of that came to the fore. We had our Rosie Riveters still, and after most of the wars, the women would sink back into not doing such a public life, being representatives or running industries or so on. But the situation in Europe was somewhat similar to that. The situation then at the end of the war, you also had the flu epidemic coming in.
Oh, yes, that's right.
And that removed an enormous number of people, even people still in the service, even people who had been demobilized were dying of it.
Right.
And I know my mother at that time had just had my second brother, and they had somebody in helping a teenage gal, and fortunately neither my mother nor my father nor either the children got the flu, but this young teenager did. She got the flu and died of it quickly. So you had that factor coming in. So you had too few people, and you did have technology rising, and maybe that had something to do with it. In the 20s especially, I know television actually began in the 20s. Movies were very primitive at the time of World War I. After the war, they had gotten better, a lot better, and were then developed. The seed had been planted, so to speak. They got better. For that, television, radio improved vastly. But you couldn't do any of these things that you could start to do in the 20s. So it was really a watershed. And I don't think we could say that there was that much of a big change after any of our major wars. After the Civil War, women got into doing more things. Of course, they ran farms anyway.
Right.
But that still went on. But there wasn't this night and day change. You still got around the same way. You still had the same international friends, so to speak, countries that you were friendly with. The balance of power was fairly stable. In our century, we did have robber barons. We had some periods there that were not so good, and where the Supreme Court was making decisions that were, not always for the underdog, but for the powerful classes. But the situation as it developed then and on into this century, you had kind of practice wars, and when they ended, they were really ended. The Russo-Japanese War, for instance, when it ended, it was over. The Russians had been proved to be very weak. The Russians did not learn a lesson from that, and they had a huge, unwieldy country and a terrible transportation system, and they had a different railroad gauge. They should have stamped that out early, but bigger. But that's sort of what sank them in World War I, because Russia, at the end of that war, Now, in the middle of that war, Russia was ripe for change because Lenin and the Bolsheviks had been banished, and the Germans saw to it in the middle of the war that they got back to Russia. And this was after the democratic government had been formed in the spring of 1917. And they made their points right away. But they didn't win right away either. And in a way, you could say that World War I extended a little bit that way, because in Western Russia, in the very area now where all these problems are going on, where the Russians trying to grab Ukraine, that's where a lot of this problem occurred. And you had a whole British Air Force unit stationed there, and one American flyer was attached to, decided he'd stay for a while and keep flying, and then go home later. And he wrote a book later. And that book is really fascinating, with all these same places, you know, the Sea of Azov and the cities coming down from it, where they had their missions. So that went on, and you had the Bolsheviks in the Far East. I think we talked about that not too long ago. The only time American forces were ever stationed on Russian soil occurred in 1918 there, where the Americans were running the Trans-Siberian. So in a way, the war went on. The prisoners from the German side that the Russians had been holding were trying to get out to the east. And that perked up. Everybody started hearing about cities named Vladivostok and some places they never heard of before.
Right.
The Japanese were on our side in that war, so the Japanese didn't suffer from it. But here were the Germans, a good deal of their territory chopped up. The French, a lot of their territory chopped up, and Belgium just awful. So much of it was there. And digging trenches, I mean, really literally chopped up.
Right.
And the air situation, there's a very good book by a woman who spent the war in Belgium, a Belgian woman, and she describes what happened at that point. The Kaiser, of course, Germany had no government, the Kaiser abdicated, and he went to Holland, but he was in Belgium for a while as well. And what was going on there, the machinations trying to find one thing or another. So the war, it ended on paper. There were attempts to end it before that, particularly for certain ones to get out, but they came to naught. The Russians had no treaty rights or anything after what. There they were, just in hubbub and in turmoil. That finally was settled. It was into the 20s until it was. And these units were evacuated from Russia, but Russia had no forces anymore. Little bands here and there. So Cossacks, literally from the, what shall I say, the group known as the Cossacks, not just people who acted that way, but the actual group was very active, and some of these people who had nothing to do took over, got into that. The Red Cross went over there and was operative. People like Herbert Hoover gave huge sums of money for relief, but everything was just all awash. The countries came back from it, some of them sooner, but even England had been just financially drained, and the Germans were starving. The United States came to the fore. The balance of power shifted, because where before the war you had the aristocracies in England, in France, in Germany, ruling from the top. The balance of power was through these many alliances that I have mentioned, came into being, so it was stable for a time, but vulnerable when the spark occurred, and when these alliances started to bing, 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 come into force. That's what did it. The balance of power had changed drastically after the war. Some countries didn't even exist. Turkey was about to become a republic, but Turkey was pretty well out of the reckoning. Turkey had actually tried to help against the Germans, but what could they do? So the situation was vastly different than afterward, when it trickled down into two main powers. Now, on into the 30s, Germany, France too weak to count for an awful lot, especially Germany. But they built up, and they were not tromped on for doing it because it was against the treaty rules. And oftentimes, as we see today, treaty rules, legal rules are very often flouted, and nobody forces. They think, well, they had a hard time, let it be. But that caused an overnight change in the balance of power. When the Germans were out of the picture, there was these two big powers, United States and Russia, and this was so different from the situation before, where you had all these little, where you had a few big ones and all these little ones, and the treaties binding them. And it's very difficult. Yalta, when the Yalta meeting occurred, you remember that, people blame President Roosevelt, for yielding to Stalin in giving away certain pieces of property and certain rights. But there still was not the day and night change after World War II. The same powers existed. There hadn't been this massive exchange of territory that had occurred in Europe. It just seems that the end of that war was, in a way, it started something else. Of course, everything started to develop after a war, rebuild. You'd think the labor situation would be solved because everybody could have a job, but the problem was there weren't enough, and they weren't all trained. You know, how do you take a bookkeeper who survived the war and turn him into an engineer, or vice versa? They have people, all of those stories of.
We're winding down.
Well, I'll just go ahead and mention these veterans of the wars. Even World War I, of course, our country didn't have the same problems.
Because we weren't in the war that long.
Our daily life was probably like here in World War II. Our daily life was not changed unless we lost somebody and missed somebody. But we could always get a job. If we lost a job that we had, we could always get another one. But that situation was not there. Veterans were on street corners selling apples for a nickel, and apples didn't even cost a nickel in the olden days. But you saw none of that now. In fact, there's been a great upsurge in the care of veterans, and that began right after the war. The GI Bill, for example, and such things. So that war was really a pretty horrible war. Over 7 million people actually killed, let alone some more millions that were
injured,
incapacitated. And you had.
It seemed to me, though, that both wars tended to make the country's leaders realize they had to cooperate with each other, that we're in a world society.
Well, it should have, but it didn't, because it was the same with weapons. In the Civil War, somebody invented Gatling invented the machine gun. It was called a Gatling gun, where all you had to do was turn a crank and you could fire. You could cut somebody in half. You not only make sure you hit them. This is so horrible, we won't have any more wars. Well, little wars popped up all over the place. In World War I, these things developed. Look what we've got here now. We've got this air war. Nothing is safe. An undersea war, the whole bit. We'll never have another war because this is too horrible. In World War II, atomic weapons. We'll never have another one because this is so horrible. And they're playing with it now. So, because there's another example of how we don't learn.
There are always people who want more than they.
But your heart
have.
still aches for it, really,
It does,
when you see the terrible waste of.
Okay, maybe we'll learn a lesson one of these days.